The connections for the motherboard are in the motherboard manual. We flip over to the appropriate page. You can see here a diagram of the front panel connectors and where they are on the motherboard. The motherboard is actually this way around in the case, and you can see here on the diagram the processor, the 2 memory slots here, and the 3 expansion slots down here. The blow-up view is of this connector here, which is this series of pins along the edge of the board. Now the connections give us sockets for hard disk light, power switch, power LED, and reset. So let's identify those first of all and put them in place. So we'll start with the hard disk light, HDD. Now notice there are 2 wires here. We've got a coloured wire and a white wire, and this is the case for all of these wires. There's 1 coloured stripe plus a white. The white wire is always the negative and the coloured stripe is the positive. And looking at our diagram, we can see that it has to go in this way around with the positive towards me and into this position here on the board. I'll just carry on and put the rest of the switches in. Reset switch is next, which goes down here. Power LED, I'm just checking that I get this round the right way. Goes down here. This one's a little bit more awkward because the 2 pins of the plug are actually separate, so we could put them on individually, or if we're careful about it, get them both on at once. And that leaves us with the power switch, which goes there. Right, that's the first bunch of connections. Next one is the speaker. Again, referring to our diagram in the manual, we can see that the speaker connection is up here. Again, it has 2 wires, but they're separated this time by 2 spaces. It doesn't matter which way around this goes, the speaker will work in either direction, but the correct way to put it round is like that. And we'll just place that into the socket. Right, all we've got left now is a USB connection and an audio connection. Again, we can refer to the manual, but the audio connection is over here at the back of the case, next to the external audio sockets. So we just need to line this up. They actually make this quite easy because on the plug there's a blank, and on the motherboard there's a pin missing, so it won't go in the wrong way around unless you try really hard. So line it up correctly and put it down onto the connector on the motherboard. Last one is the USB connection, because this case has a couple of USB ports on the front panel. Here are the wires coming from them, and we need to connect this down onto a spare USB header on the motherboard. Notice this plug also has 10 positions, but one of them has a blank, stopping us from plugging it in the wrong way. On the socket down here where it says USB, again you have 10 positions but 1 pin is missing, so we have to put it that way around and down onto the yellow header on the motherboard and push it firmly home. Right, that's it for cables. They are at the moment a little bit messy, so think about how these are going to be routed. We will be using cable ties to keep them together and keep them out of the way, but we'll do that once we put all the cables in. Right, next thing is probably the power supply. So power supply has a bunch of cables coming out from it here. Let's bring them up and have a look at them. Lots of cables from the power supply. Now we're not going to use them all. We need connectors onto the hard disk drive, the CD-ROM drive, and a couple onto the motherboard. So let's identify those. This connector from the power supply is split into a 20 pin and a 4 pin, and the arrows indicate that these two bits can fit together like that. Watch that they do fit together like that, because the two lugs here are held down by the 20 pin part of the plug. It has to go in first, the 4 pin has to go in first, and then the 20 pin part of it holds that down in the motherboard and is clipped down here onto the motherboard. So you can put it together like that and put it all in at once, or you can put the 4 pin in first and allow the 20 pin to lock the 4 pin connector in place. Let's see where that goes on the motherboard. Here's the socket for it. So line it up, support the board at the edge, put the 4 pin connector in, and then the 20 pin connector in, and clip down, and that's secured the 4 pin connector as well. Make sure the plug is flush and right into the socket. So we've just put the 20 pin connector in here. Notice that the motherboard needs also a 4 pin connector, and here's the 4 pin plug that we're going to use for that. This plug has 2 yellow wires, 2 black wires, and 4 connections. But it also has a clip. So make sure that lines up properly with the socket. So we'll look at the socket again, and you'll see that there's a little lug at the edge of the socket where this clips in. So line it up the right way around and pop the plug into place, and it clicks in. So that's the motherboard power sorted out. Now we're going to add the power into the hard disk drive. Hard disk drives nowadays can take 2 different types of power connector. Older types of hard drives use this Molex connector, 4 connections here. The more modern hard disk drives use a SATA connection, and that has 5 wires going into it. Let's find out which one ours needs. And if you have a look down the edge of the hard disk drive, you'll see that it has SATA connections on it. So we're going to have to use one of these plugs. Line it up the right way around. There's a little key position on the plug, and that lines up with the L-shaped key at the edge of the socket. And that just clicks into place as well. That leaves us some spare plugs, and we'll tidy these up in a minute. Next, we're going to have to put the power into the DVD. So, CD-ROM drive, we need to put the power into that. Again, we have to identify whether the CD-ROM needs the Molex 4 pin power connector or the SATA power connector. Let's have a look. And this one has a Molex power connector and a parallel ATA connection. So it's the older style of CD-ROM drive. So we need one of these power connectors for it. Again, these are keyed. It's got the corners knocked off the plug, so it can only go in one way round, and you can see the same on the socket there. So this has to go in that way round and just push into place. Right, that's us completed all the power wiring inside the computer. There is one more little wire that we'll attach just now, which is down here on the fan. This is of course the fan keeping the processor cool, and attached to that a 3 pin connector, power and tacho signal telling us that the fan is spinning. That's going to plug into the motherboard down here where it says CPU fan. Now notice this particular fan has a 3 pin plug, but we're offered a 4 pin socket for it. That allows this motherboard to support the type of fan which has a speed control as well. This one doesn't, so we're only going to use 3 of the 4 pins. And the little plastic lug will stop it going in the wrong way around, and we have 1 spare pin which is not readed. Again, we'll have to tidy up this wire. So we've now got the power cables connected to the disk drives. I'm going to connect up the data cable. This hard disk drive, remember, is a SATA device, so we need a SATA data cable. Quite a narrow cable, But again, remember it has a key position here. Notice the little L shape which identifies pin 1, and that has to connect in to the key on the drive. So this is going to have to go that way round and clicks into place. The other end of this cable has to go down onto the motherboard. Now we have 4 sockets available in the motherboard. Let's clear the space here and see them properly. We've got sockets here and here. It'll fit in any of them, it'll work in any of them, but the convention is to start on the lowest number socket for the boot drive, so we'll plug it into that one there. Again, watch where the key position is and put the connector in and click it into place. Right, moving up onto the CD-ROM drive. This needs the alternative type of cable, which is a parallel ATA cable. Remember, we looked at this earlier on, where it has one connector down for the motherboard and then 2 connectors allowing us to connect in 2 devices. We're going to be using just one device, so we have to use the end of the cable, this end for the device, that end for the motherboard. This middle connector will be spare. Line up pin 1, in this case it's a white stripe on the cable, with pin 1 on the device. And push the plug home. Same here, going to go into that, and it goes in that way around. Not only is there a stripe for pin 1, but there's also a notch, making sure that we can only put it into the plug that way around. Notice the key slot there for the plug. Now I could just plug it in there like that, but I'd have quite a lot of spare cable left over. So let's take the opportunity to start doing a bit of cable management. What we could do is make this cable a little bit shorter, knowing that we're going to have to tuck the cable up. We could actually make the cable just gently wrap round on itself and then plug it into the motherboard like that, so that it doesn't take up so much room, but more importantly, so that there's no loose cable to fill moving parts or hot parts within the computer. So that's quite neat. Right, next task, fitting the cards. We've got a couple of cards to fit. We've got a graphics card and a wireless network card. I'm going to fit the graphics card first because it's a bigger card and it needs a little bit extra room. So that'll show me what room's left when I want to fit the wireless card. Remember, these cards are static sensitive, so keep them in the bag until you're ready to fit them. Let's have a look at the connections for this card. We know it's a graphics card because it has connections here for the monitor, the digital connections for the monitor, the analog connections for an older monitor, and indeed this one even has an HDMI connection for a big screen TV. The slot is PCI Express, so it has to go into a PCI Express slot on the motherboard. The blue slot here is the correct type. Line up the card with the motherboard, making sure that the connections go through the rear panel, and needs a gentle pressure to push that down there, and then push down at the back of the card so that the lock clicks into place. Notice this lock down here. Let's get a wee close-up of that. The socket has a locking lever which clicks into the card and holds the bottom of the card firmly down into the socket. Now the bracket for the card has a screw hole, and that needs a screw to keep it secure. Just put that in place as well. And now that card is nice and secure in there, and the sockets are available on the outside of the case. It's just as well we did this card first, because it's actually covered over one of the sockets for expansion on the motherboard, and we now only have one slot left for our second card. We need to fit a wireless network card. It needs a PCI slot, and fortunately we have one of those available. The card itself is in an anti-static bag, and it has an aerial and a driver disc in the box as well. We'll fit the aerial later. Let's just take the bag off and have a look at the card. A couple of activity lights and the socket for the aerial on the back panel, and then the card itself has the slot connector for PCI. I'm going to fit this now into the white slot on the motherboard. Again, just line it up, bracket against the rear of the case, and then straight down into the slot and push it home. And a screw now to hold the bracket in place, and that will be us finished. That's fine, nice and secure. Right, this particular case uses a plate to cover the expansion slot, so I'll put that in place because I've now finished fitting expansion cards. So that goes in there, and the slot lines up like that, and then a screw in place here to hold that where we need it. Great, expansion cards sorted out. Now let's take the chance to tidy up some of these cables inside. We're going to use some cable ties for that. Cable ties are just nylon straps with a locking mechanism, and we're going to use them to keep the cables that we've now got spare away from any moving parts or hot parts inside the computer. First one we're going to tackle is this one over here, where we've got a couple of cables coming from the fan and from the power connector onto the motherboard. They are fairly loose and they could easily touch the fan, so I'm going to secure them against the big bunch of cables at the back here so that they can't move. So just put the strap around the whole bunch of cables and through the lock and zip it up so that it's secure. Cut off the spare part of the cable tie so that it doesn't foul anything. And do the same down here where we've got the cables coming from the front panel and the cable from the hard disk drive. I'm tempted here to tidy up this cable as well, so let's take that off and do a little bit of tidying on this cable while we're at it. And then just take the cables that are spare from the power supply and from the front panel and put a cable tie around them, and that stops them moving about inside the computer.